Hi there, I'm Rudyard Griffiths, moderator of the Munk debates. We do, for each debate, a series of pre-debate interviews. We get some views, insights, and analysis from our presenters on the topic they're addressing. It's my pleasure now to speak with Yanis Varoufakis, who will be arguing for the motion tonight. Be it resolved, the capitalist system is broken. It's time for something different. Yanis, great to have you here in Toronto.
It's very good to be here, Roger. Thank you.
I want to start on opening this present of your ideas that you're giving to this debate slowly and carefully. And if you could explain maybe to the audience, what kind of drew you initially to a critique of capitalism? Was this something that your academic work exposed you to? Was it a real life experience? What made you into this searing critic of the capitalist model?
Well, to begin with, I believe that we should always be critical of the world we live in. Whether you live under feudalism or in ancient Athens or in China, you should always be critical, because unless you are critical, there is no scope for improvement. My interest in capitalism dates before my student days even. So I've always been in a steady engagement of simultaneously being extremely struck and impressed by capitalism and appalled at the very same time. This dialectical, sort of conflictual relationship has been a driving force in my life.
And you are an academic. You trained and taught as a professor. What did you take out of your academic career in terms of an appreciation or understanding of both capitalism's power to transform, but also, as you feel, maybe its capacity to dehumanize us?
Well, what I learned from my experience of teaching in economics departments for decades has very little to do with capitalism itself. What it has to do with is the fantastic capacity of economists to build, pyramids, gigantic pyramids of economic modeling without having anything in them that pertains to the essence of capitalism. That is, forever fascinating for me. If you look at the economic models of the world we live in, you'll be struck if you manage to home in on some important missing ingredients by the fact that they're missing. There's no money in economic models of capitalism, and there's no debt. Now imagine, actually there's no time either, because if you introduce time, the mathematics is simply unsolvable. So how can you have these wonderful minds working for so long, getting Nobel Prizes, Kenneth Arrow, all these monoliths of the human intellect, and yet the models that they built have nothing to do with really existing capitalism. That contrast between reality and the whole profession dedicated to not seeing it, and yet getting a lot of kudos out of being the experts on capitalism. That is, it's just incredible, isn't it?
Well, let's go from academia to the real world. You're sitting in the Greek parliament now. You've had a very active role in Greece's politics since the eurozone crisis of really the last decade after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. What lessons do you take away from that experience in terms of some of these fundamental faults or defects that you see in the modern, the contemporary, the so-called late capitalist era that we're in right now?
Well, we live the great failure of 1971, 15th of August. Do you remember when Richard Nixon proclaimed the end of Bretton Woods? That was the end of the 20 years, the golden era of capitalism. The Bretton Woods system was quite remarkable, and it is what created the sense we still have that capitalism is a very successful enterprise. But that broke down in 1971, and ever since, Bretton Woods just died on us. We have multiple crises. In the European Union, there's been a frantic effort to replace Bretton Woods, the fixed exchange rate regime that led to the euro, which then led to massive crises, bubbles that burst, and the trials and tribulations of my people, of the German people for that matter today, and so on the one hand. It also led to a very interesting global phenomenon, whereby after 1971, the United States, from being the surplus country, the country that effectively was the creditor nation of the world, became the deficit nation of the world. And those deficits were instrumental in sucking into the United States the net exports of Canada, of Japan, of Germany, later China, and creating what we call financialized globalization, which then went into a major spasm in 2008. So in a sense, we are all children of a permanent crisis that began in 1971.
Let's try some arguments out on you that you're going to hear during this debate. Probably the most prevalent argument for the current capitalist system is its perceived ability to eradicate poverty. That if we look back over the last quarter century or more, we've seen literally hundreds of millions of people lifted out of abject poverty with the introduction of capital, free market, free enterprise style reforms. Do you accept that that is an enduring positive power and feature of the current capitalist global order?
Not just the current, capitalism in general. And you don't have to rely on a supporter of capitalism. Think of Karl Marx. He was the one that eulogized capitalism for having dragged us out of backwardness, out of the superstition of the Middle Ages, out of feudalism, and having created...
The idiocy of rural life was his quote.
Yeah, indeed. And having created immense wealth, while at the very same time creating new-fangled forms of deprivation and poverty. So the poverty in England of the 19th century, the poverty that you have in parts of India now, where the old agrarian society is being transformed by Monsanto and the new techniques of production, creating a new social disaster, the ecological catastrophe. So that's what capitalism is. It is a very interesting primitive force that unleashes fantastic capacities while at the same time creating gigantic crises.
Well, let's move on to some other arguments, no doubt, that your opponents are going to bring up tonight. One that they'll point to, talking about the ecological crisis, is the idea that more prosperous, more capitalistic societies, through innovation, through their ability to create new technologies, benefit from cleaner environments, and that capitalism is actually an engine for a cleaner environment. It is a tool that we need to apply, not take away to humanity's confrontation with the crisis of climate.
It's a gross mistake to identify capitalism technology. The more technology, the better. We need more technologies, not fewer technologies. The cleaning up of the planet, ecological sustainability, wealth, shared prosperity will depend on our capacity to have better and more machines. There's no doubt about it. The question is whether what we now call capitalism really exists in capitalism, not theoretical capitalism, right? Because there is a profound difference between the two. In the same way that in the Soviet Union, where there's a fundamental chasm between the theory of communism and the reality of communism. Similarly, there is a similar chasm here. What we now have is gigantic concentration of market power in very, very few corporations and very few shadowy financial firms that control the corporations. And we have a lot of waste of technological potential, while at the same time, the market was never designed to provide public goods. The market was only designed to provide private goods. The environment is a public good. The market will always create profits for the corporations by depleting the natural resources to which the market will always assign a zero price. So the question is, how can you ameliorate for this drive? Can the state do it? No, the state cannot do it, because our states, our democracies, have completely been usurped by the concentration of money. Effectively, our politics has been purchased by those who have an interest in depleting the natural resources of the planet. So markets, we do need them. We cannot do without them. Technology, without technology, I don't want to live on this planet or any other planet for that matter. But the question is, how do we organize economic and social life in a way that those technologies and the markets can be freed from corporate abuse?
Let's talk about another aspect of this debate, which will be the supposed political theory that underlies current capitalist thinking. This idea that capitalism and democracy are somehow closely intertwined, and that if you reduce the scope of the free market, if you curtail the opportunities for free enterprise, you're undermining, you're eroding people's personal freedom. Well, your opponents tonight, I think, are going to live and die on that precept.
I hope they don't, because then all I have to do is just utter one word: China. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it. That's the end of the conversation. Not just China. Think of Britain, England in the 19th century, late 18th century and 19th century. There was no democracy. Liberalism, remember, was the opponent of democracy. The great liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill opposed democracy. For them, giving the demos the opportunity to decide goes against liberal principles and against the free market. So this association of liberalism with democracy is a very recent thing, and it's not doing very well. And China proves that this is not at all the case. The problem is this. Capitalism creates not just wealth, as we said before, but also crises that undermine its own sustainability since 1929. The democratic politics angle was essential in stabilizing capitalism. Think of the New Deal in the 1930s. Think of every crisis, financial crisis, that gives rise to a political attempt to pick up the pieces and create social sustainability and economic and financial sustainability again. So democracy comes in when capitalism goes through a spasm and falls on its face and cannot get up. The trouble now is, and you can see this with Donald Trump, you can see it with Brexit, you can see it with the rise of the nationalist international, as I call it, with authoritarianism all over the place from Brazil to India. The problem is that democratic politics is broken, and its fate is intertwined with increasing concentration of corporate power.
Let's talk about increasing concentrations of wealth generally. A big feature of this debate will no doubt be the topic of economic inequality. Thomas Piketty, others have argued that economic inequality is, in a sense, the status quo of capitalism. It's not an episodic feature. It is something that intensifies and runs through the capitalist history of the last 200 years. Is that something that you subscribe to?
It is definitely the case. Empirically, you can see that this is the only time when inequality has declined was when there was a planned economy in the West. Bretton Woods, for instance, right? When effectively Franklin Roosevelt banned bankers from being in the Bretton Woods Conference and turned banking into plain vanilla boring banking finance. But my concern is not so much inequality, which may sound strange coming from a left-winger. My concern comes from the division of the world, of society, into two classes. Into those who don't even know what to do with all the money they're accumulating. And you can see how angst-ridden they are. There are billionaires all over the place calling for the reform of capitalism. Okay? And the rest, who are not simply falling behind in relative income or wealth terms, but who can see that their children are going to have a far worse life than they did, who live in precariousness, who live in a world in which uncertainty is the order of the day. That feeds into discontent. Discontent feeds into anger. Anger feeds into racism, into xenophobia. Peace is in trouble as a result. You can see how easily somebody like Donald Trump can jump on a soapbox and promise people that he's going to make them proud again, that he's going to turn against, he's going to drain the swamp and so on. And in the end, usurps the power that anger bestows upon him in order to put somebody from Goldman Sachs into the treasury. That is the reason why the present degree of inequality is symptomatic of a dynamic that makes the society in which we live, especially if you couple it with the ecological dimension, unsustainable.
So this is where I want to end with you. What does the future look like? I mean, there's a Marxist critique that capitalism will collapse under its own contradictions, that these extremes will become so extreme that there's a political crisis that follows an economic crisis.
This crisis is happening. Europe is ungovernable. I've just arrived from Europe. There is no such thing as Europe anymore. I mean, remember what Henry Kissinger used to say when no one to call. Exactly. Whom do I call? Look at the United States. Look at global governance. There is no such thing. The World Trade Organization is toast. The United Nations is a joke. The G7, the G20, they're just gathering places where people just exchange insults. So the political crisis is definitely with us. Racism and xenophobia is on the way up. Everybody talks about the migration crisis when there is no migration crisis. We have the same number of migrants and refugees that we had in 1961. This is a moral panic. What is the future holding for us? I have no idea. Nobody knows. This is the wild beauty of indeterminacy. But capitalism is certainly a passing phase, like feudalism was. There is no such thing as a natural order of things in human society. Technological innovations will make sure that very soon, with the 3D printer, with artificial intelligence and so on, there will be no reason to have corporations. You know, the economies of scale that sustain General Motors and General Electric and so on will no longer be there. So the question is, what follows? The machines are going to do most of the work. But the question is, are we going to move towards a Star Trek society where the machines are working for us and we can explore the universe and have philosophical conversations along the lines of humanism? Or are we going to move towards something closer to the Matrix, where we are all serving the machines and we are simply, victims of a false consciousness that we have created? That's our choice.